Hi, hello and welcome. I'm Tulsi Kamath. I'm the managing editor of Lookout Santa Cruz and the author of the Morning Lookout newsletter that some of you receive. Thank you for joining us tonight for this really important discussion on race and discrimination. Before we get started, I'm going to give y'all some programming notes. Firstly, we'd like to thank our co-sponsor of tonight's event, the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz. And we'd like to thank our media partners, the Capitola SoCal Chamber of Commerce, the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, and the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. So secondly, before tonight's event, I'd like to just say, we're not here to debate whether systemic racism exists. We at Lookout as an organization acknowledge that it very much exists and that countless people struggle every day as a result of it. We are here today to discuss solutions and a path forward, and that's something that's deeply intrinsic to Lookout's mission. And finally, a request to our audience tonight. Let's try and be respectful. Tonight's topic is a tough one, and it's one that's polarized our country for as long as we've existed. We won't, so tonight's event, the format will be a TED Talk style format where our speakers will delve into their topics for 10 minutes. We will not have a Q&A at the end, but we will leave the chat open for you to talk to each other and share your thoughts. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker tonight, Kat Willis. Kat is the founder and executive director of the Tannery World Dance and Cultural Center. She's also a founding member of the Santa Cruz County Black Coalition for Justice and Racial Equity and is a founding director of the Black Health Matters initiative. Tonight, Kat's going to be reflecting on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the impact of that tragedy, both on a national level and locally. She's also going to talk about the great racial justice work being done in our community today and the Black Health Matters initiative. Kat?
Thank you so much, Tulsi. Good evening, everyone. And thank you to Lookout Santa Cruz for this opportunity to talk and the whole team for just giving a platform for this necessary conversation. I'm proud to join this conversation tonight, and it's an honor to be here with all of these speakers and to have an opportunity to speak. I speak tonight as a community member, as a mother, a sister, and a friend. I speak for myself, and as always, I try to speak from the heart. As we all know, the Black community is not a monolith, and my work and my words reflect my love of where I come from, my heritage and culture, my ancestors, and those that have been doing this work since the day that they were brought here to this country, and we have been here in this country. I want to take a moment to honor the indigenous peoples of Santa Cruz, California, and recognize that we are on traditional homelands of the Amu-Matsun tribal band, and that we are all here as guests. I also want to thank the local Asian American community, the LGBT, POC, and white allies who have stood with us in solidarity and support as we have faced this racial reckoning through the pandemic and the political pandemic of Trump. To tell you the truth, I have so much to say and at the same time, so little. What George Floyd's murder showed all of us and the subsequent deaths of Black people in this country at the hands of police since his murder is that it has revealed the deep lack of humanity we've come to as Americans. When we speak about the value of George Floyd's life, that his Black life mattered, we speak to the fact that he was a father, he was a brother, and he was a son to somebody. So for the murderer, whether that was a police officer or not, who was able to put his knee on George Floyd's neck for so long, for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, I believe we've come to a very sad place as a country. I was struck and pained by the witnesses at the Derek Chauvin trial who spoke of their filming of the murder, American citizens who were brave enough to stand and bear witness to a public execution, a public lynching, and a callous murder taking place before their eyes and having little power to stop what was happening. That is the very definition of systematic racism. The system of police policy, culture, and practice stopped those around them from saving George Floyd's life. But it was also the very deeply painful part, which was the fact that all of us, all over this country and all over the world, witnessed this murder collectively. It was traumatic. And as a nation, I believe we are still reeling from it. I hesitate to say that we are now healing because there has been a trial and a conviction. One conviction. There are more to go. For Black and Brown people, I hear the same sentiments echoed daily, sentiments that reflect my own feelings internally. We are tired. We want to rest. And yet again, the largest movement in the history of the world towards justice beckons us once again. Injustice will not disappear because we have stopped paying attention. It cannot be willed away through Instagram posts and relegating Black Lives Matter to the same political trope of the angry Black protester bent on burning and looting. We cannot lean on the hyper-politicized false equivalents of anti-Black mass incarceration and unaccounted police brutality to the notion that bringing true justice means blue lives do not matter. This is an American problem. The Black Lives Matter movement has nothing to do with politics. This is a human rights issue. It is about our willingness and understanding that Black lives in America face inequity and injustice systematically, and it must be made right. Our legacy and the American legacy of our forebears is riddled with disenfranchisement after disenfranchisement, roadblock after roadblock, and the consistent insistence that Black and Brown people remain at the back of the bus, the back of the line, and the last to take a seat at the table. We are under-resourced, underrepresented, and over-policed, and the work we must embark on as a nation and as a community requires that we look closely at this reality as one. We should and can, as Americans, ask the hard questions about the culture of policing in communities of color. We should all value justice and fairness and accountability if it means all of us will live in a society in which my Black son will receive the same treatment for getting pulled over for driving without a headlight as his white best friend, that our police officers will view both of them as the young adults that they are, not one as an inherent criminal. Defund the police is not an irrational call to strip police of their ability to serve and protect American communities. It means we are creatively working with police leadership, community members, and mental health experts to identify how police budgets can build mental health responses instead of guns drawn. It means over time, less money spent on bodies in our county jails, but human lives taking real steps for rehabilitation or the kind of deep mental health care needed for drug addiction and mental illness. The murder of George Floyd changed something very deep inside of me and inextricably. To speak so frankly to all of you today, I would not have done that a year ago. Not for a lack of urgency to speak on white supremacy and racism in our society and our community, but because I was frightened of being targeted, that my family or community might be physically hurt in some way. The backlash to progress is very real. And as you might imagine, this very platform tonight had to be closed so that those who seek to attack progress could not just drop in and bomb the discussion that we're having right now. So the truth is, American society must define and acknowledge first that systematic racism even exists. This ism called race requires that we take that step, as they say in Ghana, West Africa, one by each. Whether we are talking about Minneapolis or Oakland or Detroit or Compton or Santa Cruz, we know that this work will not get us to the mountaintop unless all of us, and I mean white folks too, join the work locally and nationally. We must understand how race plays a role in our lives and the lives of our fellow Americans. As Martin Luther King said, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That is the interrelated structure of reality. I wanted, of course, take a moment to talk about Santa Cruz and how I've had the honor and privilege of working in this town for 20 years at the Tannery Art Center for 10 and TWDCC, Tannery World Dancing Cultural Center. And I'm so grateful for all of the relationships that I have with all of these people and work alongside in this community. In June of last year, the local chapter of the NAACP held several Zoom calls for the Black community to gather in the wake of the George Floyd murder. Over the course of the summer and fall of 2020, our community came together through Zoom and found safety. We found one another and were buoyed by our collective power to make real lasting change in Santa Cruz for all Black residents. Eventually, this convening led to the formation of the Santa Cruz County Black Coalition for Justice and Racial Equity. This set us on a course of community building, advocacy, and convening local government and partners to identify how racism shows up in our county. We unearthed through our work the revelation that there simply was no concise or targeted data available on the Black community because we had been categorized as other as a demographic within the budgetary office at the county. Since then, racism was declared a public health crisis, and necessary initiatives like our partnership with the United Way to gather that data on the Black community are being put into place. We are rebuilding a community that represents all of us, that has equity, fair distribution of resources, and investment at the core of the work. Black Health Matters expands on this work and the work of the Santa Cruz County Black Coalition and the glaring need for our community to make space, to take up space, and support one another through a network of leadership, community building, and health advocacy and services. This has been a personal lifesaver, and I have to share that Mental Health Monday Sunset Walk with County Park Friends host Aniko Milan last Monday at Natural Bridges had 20 Black residents overjoyed to be amongst one another and feeling safe in the park with a sense of connection to living in beautiful Santa Cruz. I received a couple of texts from friends who attended saying that people kept asking them where they were from. And it seems like that we are not the only ones who have grown very familiar being the only ones in this community. So if you ask me what has changed on a local level in Santa Cruz since last year, so much. This work is purposeful. Yes, representation and diversity is paramount, but really what we want to see overall is the quality and life and health for all residents in our community. It is about non-Black leadership and solidarity, standing up and using their positions and resources and creativity to work with us to create a county we can all be proud of, feel safe in, and share in the bounty of our oceans, our trails, our local businesses and services, schools, affordable housing, fresh and healthy food, and culture. As I close, I would like to take a moment to just share who our advisors are. Tulsi will be pulling up some pictures. I hope that you will reach out to me and ask, I hope that you will all reach out to me and ask about Black Health Matters and the work that we're doing in the community. I'm happy to share all of the work that we've put together and what we have planned for our community. We need all of your participation to improve the life and the health of the Black community in this county. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak.
I'm just going to quickly go through the rest of the slides. Okay, thank you so much, Kat. We really appreciate it. And actually, something you touched upon kind of very naturally goes into what Natalie will be talking about. Natalie is a community organizer with Regeneración in Watsonville in the Pajaro Valley, and it's a group that is fighting for climate justice. Natalie was born and raised in California and was exposed to extreme outcomes of environmental degradation when she was growing up, and that is what drove her to pursue a career in environmental justice. And she believes that policing reform is actually very closely tied to environmental justice. In fact, right after this event, Regeneración will be hosting a webinar to talk about just that. So Natalie has very kindly agreed to give us an overview of the much larger conversation they'll be having at 7 o'clock. And if you want to participate in that event after this one, I will drop a link to that event in the chat so you can jump in there. Natalie?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kat. I'm so honored to hear you speak. I'm like still shaking for how moved I am. So thank you all for having me here. I'm so honored to be among all of these speakers and in this space. I'm the community organizer with Regeneración, a climate action organization. And when most people think of climate and the environment, they think of melting polar ice caps and saving the rainforest or recycling. But I think of people. I grew up in the Central Valley, where we consistently ranked highest for the most polluted air in the nation because of emissions caused by oil and gas extraction and industrial agriculture. Growing up, my siblings and I all had respiratory issues. So when I think of environmental justice, I think about my family and my communities. I think of Watsonville, where our predominantly Latinx population are already on the front lines of climate impacts. Our 2018 community survey found that 74% of agricultural workers, their families or neighbors experience extreme heat conditions in their workplace. So when we take a step back and ask, how did this happen? How are so many communities, particularly communities of color, experiencing these unjust realities? The answer is racism and centuries of oppression and exploitation. Climate change is not the problem in itself. It is the symptom of this much larger issue. It is the result of our unjust history. It's fueled not by mystical greenhouse gases that appeared in our atmosphere, but by unjust and racialized systems, which allowed white people to fuel environmental degradation at the expense of Black and brown lives. Researchers have found that air pollution is disproportionately caused by white Americans' consumptions of goods and services, but disproportionately inhaled by Black and Hispanic Americans. Hop Hopkins from the Sierra Club said, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." And I think that really encapsulates the roots of climate change. The reality is that we'll never stop or completely address climate change and its impacts without ending racism. And the struggle for racial justice is a critical component of the struggle for climate justice. Racism and all forms of oppression must be eliminated for the dignity and human rights of us all, and so that we can unite to avert the climate crisis. And so in this past year, we've seen more and more environmental organizations waking up to this reality. We've been asked to speak to many audiences about what environmental racism looks like and how we can dismantle it, but there's so much more work to be done. Until our communities realize just how deeply racism is woven into the fabric of our societies, we can't begin to properly address solutions. Equity and racial justice is not just a checklist of actions. It is a deep commitment to the process of unlearning centuries of racist colonial beliefs and working to dismantle them. A little over a year ago, myself and a group of volunteers formed our advocacy committee. We began to organize on how we can best advocate for climate justice. The Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's death galvanized our committee to focus on the issue of police violence and to take a serious look at how our cities are spending our money to support our communities. And so we worked to analyze Watsonville's budget and inform the community on what our city's spending looks like, and advocated for more transparent and democratic processes going forward. And what we found paralleled the rest of the nation. In 2017, the United States spent 115 billion on policing. That same year, it spent only 8 billion on the Environmental Protection Agency and 7 billion on the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In Watsonville, over 40% of our general fund goes to policing. Meanwhile, departments like Public Works, Parks and Community Services, and Community Development are each at 10% or below of the general fund. Money for policing is money that's not funding climate adaptation and mitigation or the real root causes of our societal issues. Climate impacts such as droughts, extreme weather events, and increased wildfires worsen every year, and we need to ensure that our communities can effectively respond to these threats. So we're seeing that not only have Black and Brown communities done the least to cause climate change and are already suffering the worst impacts, but also that we have the least amount of resources to deal with these harmful impacts. At the end of the day, adapting to the risk of climate change means giving people the chance to be safe in the face and aftermath of storms, fires, and extreme weather, and that is not the role of our police departments. Our own chief of police has echoed the sentiment that the police are not the best people to respond to nonviolent calls, and that we do indeed spend too much money on policing, but claim that there are no real alternatives. But the reality is that there are other options, but it's going to take a lot of organizing and actions and willingness to think beyond the way we've always done things. So our committee is hosting an event this evening at 7 p.m. titled Reimagining Public Safety, Alternatives to Police for Nonviolent Crisis Calls, to hold a space to continue this thinking and learning. Our goals are to reimagine public safety as more than police-oriented, to share information about a proven successful and cost-effective model, and to ignite deeper conversations about ways to make our public budget work for everyone. There will be an overview of South County's Mobile Emergency Service for Youth, a program which provides community and field-based crisis intervention services to youth ages 21 and younger and their families, as well as a detailed presentation about CAHOOTS, Crisis Assistance Helping Out in the Streets, a program widely recognized as a model for community-based mobile support. The presentation will be followed by a question and answering session. And we may not have all the answers, but we can continue to learn and teach those around us and keep having these conversations until we find them. And so we hope you'll join us tonight to continue this conversation. And I wanted to share our vision at Regeneración is a community that has achieved climate justice, so all people in the Pájaro Valley can live in harmony with the natural world. And to reach this, we need to think holistically and understand the connections between these issues. We must ensure our local government is investing in health, equity, and justice. And so last, to support us or join our work, you can contact us on social media, email me, and we hope that you all can continue to back the leadership of young people of color like myself in our area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I just want to let everyone know that Natalie is our youngest panelist today at just 24, but she is incredibly impressive. Thank you for joining us. And I've shared a link in the chat if anyone in the audience is interested in continuing the growth and the discussion at 7 o'clock. Next up, we have David Anthony, who's been a professor of African history at UC Santa Cruz for more than 30 years. And outside of the world of academia, he's had a long-standing record of service in the greater Santa Cruz community. While doing my research for tonight's event, I stumbled upon his Rate My Professor page. And as one of his former students put it, he is, quote, an amazing orator and master of a million languages. And by the way, all the students suggest that you should pay attention when he's talking. Racial reckonings like the one that took place last year have happened intermittently throughout this country's history. And from these movements, great leaders have emerged who've pushed for cultural change and wider acceptance of those who've been forced to live on the margins of society. But change comes slowly, and it happens by not letting up and not letting the conversation be silenced. And that's one of the themes that David will be touching on tonight. So without further ado, David Anthony.
Thank you, Tulsi. I want to thank first Lookout for this invitation to be part of this community conversation, and everyone who is participating on any level. The panelists, the audience, the people behind the scenes, logistically, who've done all kinds of work that we don't necessarily know about, without whom it would not be possible. Let me start off by saying that this has been and still continues to be a difficult week for me, and I think for many other people. We have the anniversary of the Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 24th, 1921 pogrom. I'm partly of Oklahoman, Afro-Native, Chickasaw Freedmen descent. My grandmother, maternal grandmother, was from Oklahoma, from a little town called Wynnewood, which is about 160 miles from Tulsa. She left Oklahoma in 1921, and I never asked her what drove her away. Was it in fact that pogrom? In addition to everything else we are commemorating and we are working through right now, down to the terrible violence that has unfolded today in our neighbor, San Jose. Because this is a very violent society. There are too many guns. I sometimes wonder how to proceed. I often feel as if I'm speaking to the choir, people already clear about the existence of racism and white supremacy as problems and dedicated to do something to end it. But there are people beyond the choir who we don't reach, who will not come to attend this kind of meeting, for whom it would make a difference because we are all in this together. I want to start by taking a step back as we consider the anniversary, this very sad anniversary of the extrajudicial execution of Mr. Floyd. And that is to respect Mr. George Floyd, Ms. Breonna Taylor, Ms. Sandra Bland, all the other people who have lost their lives. We should not take liberties when commemorating these losses of murdered martyrs. We were not on a first name basis with any of them when they were alive. We were introduced to them only when and because of their assassinations. Remembering them with respect means first honoring them by addressing them respectfully, using the honorific preceding their given names. Say their names with respect. Mr. George Floyd's murderer had this grown man calling out to his mama. The most disrespectful, vile degradation anyone could be subjected to. So respect is the first thing that we need to bring to this table as we consider what these lives meant and might mean in the future. They were people. They had souls. They had families. They had histories. They deserve that from us as the beginning. In terms of continuity, unfortunately, so many of these stories are distressingly familiar. I was 69 years old a couple of weeks ago. I would have liked to think that by the time I was part of the elder community, that racism as I knew it, as I read of it, as I heard of it, as I experienced it, intergenerationally, might have been diminished to some degree. And in fact, that is not the case. It is still with us. It is still alive. And that continuity is sometimes crippling to confront. As a human being, I go catatonic. I am deeply depressed. I feel this. And I have to manufacture some enthusiasm to go forward because I'm not done. But I also know that through the arbitrary and capricious qualities of race consciousness that expresses itself in terms of supremacy, that anyone can end my life, particularly someone who has a badge and considers that that gives them the right to do whatever they feel they want to. So I'm always looking around, making sure if I'm going to circle the block, do I have my wallet? Do I have my identification? Those kinds of things, fundamental things. Differential impacts. I and my loved ones live with this consciousness and this concern every day and night, 24/7. My 3 grown children, their children, my grandchildren, all are at risk. I'm heartened to discover allies I did not know I had. Let that continue. Third, silencing and avoidance are not options. We cannot sidestep this. We cannot get over this. We cannot imagine that we can declare victory and move on. We have to move through this. We have to come to terms with it, and we have to do so as members of communities who are indissolubly linked. We are connected. Not just connected when we declare a common foe, but to understand that those things that bring us together are the things that inform who we are as human beings. We all have the same needs. The needs for shelter and nourishment and acceptance and love, being seen and being heard. But we also have the right to live in peace, to live with respect, to determine our circumstances, to protect those we love. Those fundamental concerns as human beings should always be paramount. There should be nothing more important than that. And once we achieve that, then we will have moved into something that really makes a difference in the world.
Thank you so much for sharing that, David. That was incredibly powerful. And, you know, speaking to the point of respect, you know, oftentimes we can become desensitized and we can be, we can feel kind of disconnection to what's happening, especially when it happens so many times and it happens in such brutal ways at every single time. And I can tell you a quick story before we go to our next presenter. I came here from Houston in October, and last year, around this time, right after Mr. George Floyd was murdered, there were marches and protests and rallies around the country, and Houston is his hometown. And Houston's not a protest city, but 60,000 people came out to walk with the Floyd family. And when I was there walking alongside them, covering that protest as a journalist, that was the first time I felt very much connected to this story that had become national headlines in a way that as a journalist we have to recognize and also reflect on as we cover these things. And it's truly a very terrible feeling to walk alongside a family that suffered so much loss. So thank you for sharing that. So our next speaker tonight is Maria Cadenas. She's the executive director of Santa Cruz Community Ventures, which is committed to developing compassionate and equitable local economies that contribute to the region's well-being. One of the biggest factors that contribute to the cyclical nature of systemic racism is that continuously widening wealth gap that disproportionately impacts people of color. And as Maria will explain, this isn't by accident. Policies that were founded on racist beliefs are a major reason for this. And I'll let Maria tell you more.
Thanks, Tulsi. And thank you to Lookout and everybody else who's spoken before me. I think this topic is timely, but it's also a reminder of how human it is and personal. So when I was approached to speak, I have my grass ready to share with our audience, but it really comes down to the recognition of our humanity of each other. And like we like to say in ventures, we say it needs to be founded on justice and love. If we cannot start our systems from that angle, then we are creating systems that are unjust and are not recognition of the humanity of each of us. And so when we think about the economy, a lot of people want to think about money, but I'm reminded of how I ended up at Ventures. I actually came to Santa Cruz over 10 years ago now, and my first search was actually to look for hate groups online to see where I could move to. Because and to think that I'm not the only person of color that does that. To learn about Santa Cruz through a hate lens as a sunset town, to learn about the hotspots of KKK that are right here in our community, in our mountains, and to have to navigate housing, not only because of cost, but out of fear of my safety. As some of you know, I ran for office, but how many would have considered that I had to consider my safety in putting my name on the ballot and not being comfortable in having to spend time seeking out a safe, neutral location for my campaign offices out of my own concern. And I share that because when we talk about race, which is a construct made up out of a sense of power and control, we forget how much it trickles into everyday activities, including our economic activities. Because the reality is that the economy and capitalism, if you would, and the governance and policies behind it used it to create barriers and to keep people out from not allowing Mexican Americans to have bank accounts, Black Americans to get loans, right? And all of that happened within few generations of today. This is not a far gone, never happened close to us. This is just a few generations. There were initiatives to build Black banks and credit unions a while back, but they were never funded, they were never supported, they were never leveraged, and they all died. These are conscious steps that are systemic and structural in nature from redlining to others that keep people out. And I want to remember that we're here today in part in recognition of the importance of the movement around Black Lives Matter. And is centered on the fact that this country sits on racist roots. And until we can address it and own it, then we are never going to move forward. When we look at ventures, we define very specifically that we want to create communities that are compassionate and equitable and contribute to our well-being. And when we talk about well-being, we like to say that it is the presence of the highest possible quality of life in its full breadth. It's good living standards, robust health, sustainable environment, educated people, balance, democratic participation. That is what we call well-being. And until we can aim for that and recognize it, we won't get there. The other piece is that well-being is intrinsically tied to the distribution of income and wealth. Because the greater the distribution, the more equitable distribution, the better the community does across the board. And right now we don't have that. We have great accumulation of wealth that is higher than it's ever been. And it relies on an ecosystem of policies and laws to perpetuate itself. One of the things that I have, that one of the graphs or notices that we have is that, white people have 3 times the wealth of people of color who have the same income. This is not about just, even if we owned the same home, had the same job, had the same income, same level of education, a white peer will still have 3 times the wealth. And if nothing changes, we will never address that gap. That's how significant it is. And what does that do for communities? It leaves people out. I think for ventures and for me, we say it all starts with love and justice, but it also starts with the recognition that our current social, political, and economic systems are inherently capitalist, patriarchal, and racist. So we cannot look about access or inclusion. We need to change the systems because the systems are creating the very disparities that they were meant to create. They're creating exactly the outcomes that they were designed to do. So if we do not actively address systems, then we're never going to get to a solution. When we talk about race, a lot of times there's discussions about the racial equity theories and how you get to that. Well, if you go race neutral, is that you don't talk about race. It omits race. It somehow all boats will rise. Well, that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work, right? And then you have race consciousness, arguing that race and ethnicity, are a variable in public policy and program design. But it's just, you're just being conscious about it. But if we're looking at diversity, inclusion, we're going to diversify the voices on that. But the real goal is structural racism. It's address structural racism beyond individual, beyond institutional, to a broader system that has long held historical policies and practices that still stand. When we create policies at the local level, when we say that that we're going to look at health, racism as a health issue, which is important, well, what does that mean in policy exactly? When we look at about talking about police and safety, one of the conversations I had is like, great, change the police department and move it to the health sector for the mental health providers. But that health sector is just as racist. Look at their outcomes. Look at the health outcomes. That system is just as racist as the police system. And it's not about an individual police officer, and it's not about an individual nurse. It's about the systemic structures that are in place, and we have to have difficult conversations because it's not easy. It's not easy, and it is exhausting, and it is heartbreaking, and it's constant trauma and constant reminders. For microaggressions, I know most people assume that I live in Watsonville because I'm Latina. Meet Latinos in Santa Cruz, and most people assume that they are commuting from Watsonville because they're Latinos. There's assumptions that because you're a person of color, you must be low income, right? or somehow I came from farm worker parents. There are stories and assumptions that we make that we have to keep talking against this frame that is given to us. And that's exhausting and it's tiring. And we have to do it every day, because while the news media may move on, our lives don't. And that's what we fight. And that's what we are here to debate and worry. Before I close, though, I want to say right now, the changes that are happening at a policy level are crucial. Look at the budgets that are being proposed by the governor. Those programs are around $500 for every child in first grade that is low income. Those policies around guaranteed income models, those policies about expanding Medi-Cal, policies around providing better care for childcare providers and caregivers. They're critical policies that shift the current economic structures. So if we care about that, we have to call and advocate for them to take place, and then advocate to see who is actually going to implement it, and then be there for the elected officials that took the risk to step up and say it, because those are very difficult conversations to do. I want to share with you as a closing, I haven't shared this in over 20 years, but the issue of race and identity and the burden it carries is throughout your life. I wrote this poem when I was 19 years old in a liberal arts college in Wisconsin. And I read it to you because I think it's a reminder of the anger and hurt that we carry. It's called Ratas Blancas. As if you didn't know, baby, that when you call my name, you call yourself an open-minded liberal, a hero of this 20th century. No, I'm just a label to you, a badge to slap across your breast, a proclamation of your American worldliness. And you believe, honestly believe, that if it was your fingers that held the chisel that carved the Statue of Liberty and planted those words of inspiration at its feet, because you say, I believe and live by it. But wasn't it you who refused to vote against eliminating bilingual education in California? And wasn't it you who did research to try to prove that wetbacks were the reason for your welfare problems? As if immigrants picking your strawberries and your grapes were nothing more than pests to eliminate. Yes, it was you. And it was you who informed me over lunch that immigration officers rape Mexican women just because they tried to cross the border without a visa. And you watched countless beatings and killings and racist burnings before eating dinner, as if nothing worthwhile was on television. And I want to tell you, my liberal and justice-fed friend, that you are a liar. A white rat crawling in the city, sitting yourself down with black women and brown men and black men and brown women so as to say, yeah, you did it, and anything else that sounds politically correct. Well, all the while, baby, all the while you don't give a damn. That one good single goddamn. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. That was incredibly powerful, and thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. I think before moving on, I would like to just acknowledge that I think everyone here and everyone in the audience too probably knows what it feels like to have stereotypes applied to them and have had to fight against those stereotypes for their whole lives. But it's different when it comes to oppressed groups and minorities and the ones who don't have the ability to be the loudest voice in the room. So thank you very much for sharing that. Our final speaker tonight is Spike Wong. He's a local playwright and former school teacher who was born and raised in Watsonville. When Spike and I were talking ahead of this event, I was struck by how similar his experience as a second-generation Asian American immigrant was to mine as a first-generation immigrant. There's a certain dichotomy of culture that you grow up with when your family life is very different from the life you lead outside, and yet the goal is always to achieve the American dream. This year has been particularly cruel to Asian Americans because, in part, of the racist statements made during the COVID-19 pandemic. Asian American elders are being randomly attacked in the Bay Area and around the country. And there was even a mass shooting in Atlanta that targeted AAPI lives, 8 lives. For Spike, this past year has been a period of reflection, looking back into his own family history. 3 generations of his family have embraced life in America, and at various times in their life have had to reckon with the idea that maybe America hasn't embraced them. I'll let Spike tell it.
This is the mask that I stopped wearing regularly in December of 2020. This is the mask that I've worn the past several months. Anything that more readily identifies me as a Chinese American, I have stopped wearing. There have been a couple of local incidents that could have escalated, but thankfully didn't. The San Francisco Bay Area has certainly seen its share of vile and cowardly physical attacks on Asians. And there have been many anti-Asian attacks throughout the country that have ultimately caused me to retreat. And I say retreat because when I was a little kid, my grandfather would sometimes say to me, "Do not forget, you were born in the year of the dragon." I've never forgotten that because there are implied responsibilities. There's an assumed strength, power, and compassion belonging to those that are born in the year of the dragon. I should take a stronger stance. I should use a louder voice. And yet, retreat I have. Retreated from being Chinese American. Sheltering myself once again from being seen as the other. Because Asian Americans have always been the other in the history of the United States. In 1853, George Hall of California, a white man, was declared not guilty on appeal of murder because his original conviction had come about solely due to the testimony of 3 Chinese minors. In effect, the California Supreme Court ruled that testimony from Chinese, regardless of citizenship status, was inadmissible in court. Chinese were not real people. The Page Act of 1875 banned virtually all Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. Part of the expectation was to force Chinese men back to China if they wanted to have a family. It was also believed that the majority of Chinese women wishing to enter the country were prostitutes and or women carrying diseases that would kill white men. While these events and many like them are long ago history to some, the effects of these laws and attitudes led to long-term consciousness and even acceptance of otherness among both the affected Chinese and American society in general. It's why an 85-year-old Chinese woman can be viciously stabbed from behind by a man in San Francisco. She isn't a real person. She's an other. It's why, after the random beatdown and killing of an elderly Asian man, also in San Francisco, the district attorney involved can describe the attack as, quote, some sort of temper tantrum. It's what happens to others. This classification of otherness was in full display with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This law, essentially forbidding the immigration of Chinese to the United States, was only repealed in December of 1943, and mostly to appease the political immorality of being a wartime ally of a country whose people were banned from immigrating. This act was the only law ever to forbid the immigration of a particular ethnicity to the United States. You know, I think I know why my grandfather wanted me to always remember that I was born in the year of the dragon, it wasn't a superstition. What he was doing was reminding me in his own way that he had committed the equivalent of cultural suicide by coming here, leaving one thing to become another. As an immigrant in the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, he had survived imprisonment and interrogation on Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. And he was eventually allowed to enter the US by pretending to be the son of a man already here, one of his uncles. Men like my grandfather were known as paper sons, sons on paper only. By the time his grandchildren were born, my grandfather knew that we had to give up being Chinese in order to make it in America. One day when I was a young kid, he was cutting my hair and he stopped to tell me, I suffered when I came to this country, and I suffered for you. Get your education, he told me in his village Cantonese dialect, and do it in English. That's the only way you'll survive and succeed. When I was preparing to leave high school in 1969, I approached the representative of the University of California's Educational Opportunity Program, which at the time was focused on encouraging and aiding minority students to matriculate to higher education. Here's what the recruiter told me when I asked him about my eligibility for a minority scholarship. Well, according to our program, Chinese Americans aren't minorities, so no. Otherness once again. Some other time, I will tell you the pain that the shape of my eyes has brought me. I am a statistic. I am a member of the last generation of Chinese Americans to have heard directly from the source, our grandparents, the stories about the Exclusion Act, about Angel Island, about great suffering, misunderstanding, and racism. But I don't know that much because the indignity and fear of it all kept my grandparents from discussing it at length. Yet, as Elie Wiesel wrote, whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. And because I am a witness, I view the current massive increase in anti-Asian hatred and violence as the expression of the continued fear of people who will not seek understanding or education, who would rather blame and attack, and who will listen to and believe those who would manipulate their fear by painting for them an easy, identifiable target, Asian Americans. The following monologue was created from my new play, White Sky, Falling Dragon, which was inspired by my father's military service in World War II. After his return home from the war, the main character in the play and his father struggle with the death of a younger son, Johnny, in the war. The intensity of the moment is heightened by the fact that the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in effect at the beginning of the war. Yet two sons from the same family volunteered to fight for the country that is banning their relatives. In this scene, the father is talking to his son after being asked what his real Chinese name is, a name kept secret by the father because of his fear of deportation. You want my Chinese name? I say, what for? Not for you to know. I come like cousin, on ship to US, study paper, study story about cousin in other China village. He dead, no come US. But his father already here, so I come like his son. Paper son, you know? Use his name, come US. Pretend I know all about other family. Study story on paper. I come. US man say, you go prison island. Oh, you name. Oh, we give you name, Fred. Now go. 6 months, tiny food, you know? 6 month Angel Island prison. Aya. Too many no come home from war. Why army need my 2 sons for war? You say me, why 2? US no one Chinese anyway. A school, ex-school, what that? Exclusion Act, hala. My pa, you see? Many years pass, he try come here, Kamsan. US man send my pa prison. Prison, you know? Angel Island. He die. No more heart. Island prison only for Chinese. US no one Chinese. Why US take 2 sons? Why? Why 2? Johnny, he died. He too young. Long time I leave China. I know never more see family. I here work for all our family in China. I work for Ma. I work for you. I work Johnny. All are gone. I only have picture. You see? Janaya, you number 1 son. I teach you nothing. Mongi Changlong. Wish my son, you, become dragon.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Spike. That was extremely moving. Folks, that's our time tonight. Thank you to our speakers and our audience for joining us on this very important conversation. Thanks again to the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz for being a co-sponsor of this event. Thank you to our media partners, the Capitola SoCal Chamber of Commerce, the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, and the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership for helping us make this happen. And as a token of our gratitude for joining us in these important discussions and being an engaged member of the community, we would like to offer you a discount to Lookout membership, so you can read all our coverage and be in the know about future events like this. So please keep an eye on your inboxes tomorrow for that code. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. As we have all established, the conversation is not yet over.